In this video, I'll be walking through the Criterion B section of my personal project report that managed to score me a 24 out of 24. So Criterion B mainly focuses on the application of ETL skills, in which it's recommended that you include at least two skills, one for achieving the learning goal and one for actually creating the product for your personal project. And usually two is the minimum that you want to have in order to score full marks. And there are a few options that you can choose from. You can choose research skills, communication skills, social skills, thinking skills, as well as self-management skills. It's normally good to choose skills that are more closely linked to your project, since mine mostly focuses on researching the applications of golden proportions. The ones I decided to choose was research and self-management. If for example, your personal project may involve marketing or anything that involves other people, you may include social or communication skills. It really depends on what suits your personal project the best. So the first one for achieving the learning goal, as I mentioned, I chose research skills, in which the first thing that you should be mentioning is how that skill was applied in extending your learning goal, meaning the first paragraph should be on why is that skill necessary for your specific personal project, your learning goal. So I just want to explain here, my project mostly involves research because I have to create a 50-page book in which I'll have to include information on the applications of golden proportions in numerous areas and fields, in which you can tell research is definitely necessary. So after you include why it's necessary, just a simple outline on how you manage to show that skill to extend your learning goal. For me, I laid out a research plan in which I had a detailed step-by-step plan to be able to have a smoother research process. So this answers the question of how research skills are applied. So after you say that, if you say something like you laid out a research plan, you can't just say it and not provide any evidence. Especially for Criterion B, evidence is very important. This is especially because previously in the personal project, there was the process journal in which you could include all this evidence, but now the process journal is no longer a requirement to submit. So it's important to include as much evidence in your report itself as possible because that's the main thing the examiners will actually look at. So as you can see, I included an excerpt from my research plan and more emphasis on the excerpt part because there's also a limitation in the pages that you can use. So there's no need to spend that much space on giving the evidence, but there should be some evidence to support what you said. So for me, what I included in my research plan started off with the research question, in which I just created a general idea that I wanted to focus on golden proportions. This is the main idea, and brought significance, provided important influence in numerous areas, and continue to do so in the future. So this goes towards real life applications, in which I'm not just researching for the moment, I'm researching for the future. I want applications that can help have a wider image rather than just like finding out, oh, what's golden proportions. I want to know what real life applications it can actually have. And after I created the main research question, I worked on complementary questions, which I would all include in different sections in my book. And the way I created these questions is that I focus on 3 types of questions. In which these questions include factual questions, in which they're closed-ended, they're really easy to answer. You can just easily search on the internet and you can find the answers. Included conceptual questions, in which they more require application of the theory in order to get more insight. And finally, I included debatable questions, in which they mostly require opinions, discussions. You can't easily find them online. So, in order to give my research more depth and to make it more insightful, it's always best to include these three types of questions. So, the factual questions are more like the idea of what golden proportions are, and the conceptual questions are more like how can these golden proportions be seen in nature, in man-made creations, and what benefit the application has. And discussion are more like the concept of golden proportions. Because everyone says golden proportions is seen everywhere, but is that actually true? To what significance and influence can golden proportions actually have in the future? And is it possible that there's wider implications to this idea than we believe so? Just stuff like that to make your research more insightful. So after you show all this, one important thing to include if you're working on research skills are the sources. Now, of course, you can't be including all the sources in within just this report. Of course, there's a limit. So you'll have to narrow down on mainly the important sources that you want to include. So these important sources normally will include any primary sources or secondary sources with credible origin. And this, or by origin, I mean like the author or the organization has to be credible, reliable. So you would want to avoid any sources with unknown authors or authors that don't really have any expertise in what they're discussing. And you'd also want to avoid sources that have less significance to your actual research. Reason being, you only want to include the major sources since you don't have much space to begin with. So if you're able to include any sources, it should be the sources that has the most impact on your actual research. So generally, four sources should be enough. There's no need to include so many. So what I did is I included some of my sources, four sources, along with their links, and I just gave a brief description of the source. So I gave an idea on who the source, what the origin of the source is. So the professor of mathematics at this university. This is more towards my origin. It also just shows the credibility of the source because I'm saying they're professor and they're from this university. And I also just give a rough idea on the information that I'll be able to obtain from the source, which generally just talks about the purpose of the source, what I'm hoping to gain from the source. And the second source, a thesis by this person from this university. Once again, the origin and introducing the idea of golden proportions and its history. This is the purpose, the information I'll be gaining from the source. And this, you should include at least one primary source. For me, the rest are all secondary, but they're all from credible sources. And there should at least be one primary source throughout your entire research. The easiest primary source to usually get is usually just an interview. And the reason why I chose this is because I have some debatable questions that I would like to answer. And usually the information is best obtained from the opinions of an expert, which I chose to do through an interview. So if you're talking about primary source, it's best to elaborate a bit on what you did for the source compared to the secondary source where you can just look at the link you pretty much know already. Of course, you can't expect the examiner to actually click on the link, but it's good to just provide it in case. So you should make sure your description pretty much covers the important points. So person is the origin, and they have years of teaching mathematics to higher grade. Hence, they would have sufficient knowledge and greater understanding on an array of topics. and one of them being golden proportions. This shows their credibility. And I just gave a general idea on how because the interview was done. So the COVID pandemic, physical was not possible. So I sent out an email what the project is about with a link to my interview. And I gave an idea on what type of interview questions I included to show more the significance of this source. So the interview details more debatable questions, such as whether the usage of golden proportions by mankind is coincidental, or purposeful, or whether golden proportions can have great significance and influence in the futures. So these are generally questions that you can't search online or easily find. So I thought an expert on the topic would be able to provide a more insightful perspective on the topic, and we to utilize the facts I found to get a more well thought out conclusion. So this generally just answers the question on why. It shows the significance of a primary source. For secondary, you could just show what type of information they give you, but for a primary source, usually the information you get from a primary source most of the time would not be so factual. It won't be something you can easily find through a Google search. So it's important to more explain in detail the significance of the source. And the last one, also a secondary source, digital file by this person, the origin, and provides a general overview, the array of applications of golden proportions. This is the purpose. So that's generally what you can give as evidence to show that you conducted your research, you actually did all this. And moving on from that, you'll have to talk about the strength of the ATL skill. For me, I'm talking about research. So generally the way I structure this is, the way you should structure this is mostly you talk about what you did, you talk about how you did it, and talk about why you did it. These are mainly just the 3 points that you always have to consider when you explain anything. So what, how, and why. So why you did it is the significance. Or usefulness. Okay, so if we were to look at my answer, what I wrote is that research plan was useful to outline every step to take during my research process with a good flow. So for instance, I give a point. I started with research on a detailed introduction to golden proportions, which acted as a good starting point for book and also strengthened my self-understanding on the topic, allowing me to use the basic knowledge to analyze and comprehend information on the applications of golden proportions that I found. So this is generally an idea of what I mentioned down here. So what I did is I started with research on a detailed introduction. That's what I did. How I did it is I outlined every step to take during my process of the good flow. And why I did it, these two are the reasons as to why I did it. So it sort of just gives an idea of what you did and explains why you did it. And besides this, you can always include any extra benefits that the skill would have on you. So what I was whenever I reached a wall, I was unsure of what to do, got confused. Referring to this research plan always put me back on track. The proper outline told me what I had to do at the moment, how it was connected to what I had to later accomplish. And one more important thing to notice that if you're working on if you're talking about research skills, one important thing to always talk about are your sources, in which you have to connect back to the sources that you previously mentioned in the research plan. So I also picked out potential useful sources. I could assess my research, hence the research went smoothly. I visited a variety of sources, and these include primary sources, which include first-hand information, interviews and theses, which if you look back at my sources, I already mentioned a specific interview and a specific thesis that I looked at, and already published books helped me strengthen my understanding of the concept. And the most common form of research I conducted was online research. I visited and analyzed articles, videos, digital files. You can see this source was also mentioned previously, and discussion forums to obtain perspectives from amateurs and professionals alike. So when you talk about sources in the research plan, you should only include credible sources. But when you talk about the general strengths of your research plan, it's all right to mention sources that are not too credible, as long as you explain the usage of it. So what I wrote is I wanted to obtain perspectives not from professionals but also amateurs, because it allows me to obtain more perspective. So as you can explain, you can say anything as long as you provide an appropriate explanation for it. One more thing I did was that I used the cards method in order to analyze sources to determine their credibility, which allowed me to find any useful and reliable sources for my research. And I try to use a balance of primary and secondary sources. This is usually a good point to mention as they complement each other. So primary sources gives credibility, and secondary sources show how a piece of work is related to existing research. And just some more elaboration. Topic of golden proportion is not so often discussed, which made it difficult to find information from experts. So it led me to search for as many sources as possible from credible authors. So this also goes back to the sources previously mentioned. And if you explicitly mention a source, you should include the in-text citation of the source as well. I could consult an expert and pay their perspective. This is beneficial for my learning and the credibility of my product as well. So use the sources as other sources may not provide as much reliable information. So I could use these credible sources to cross-check with other sources to determine how reliable they were beyond using the cards method of evaluation. And finally, just at the end, I gave a very brief rundown of my entire research process. So I started source searching, was the first thing I did, found reliable and credible sources, gathered them in a document, then search each source separately and copy pasted plausibly useful information, which I could later analyze and rephrase in my own words. And putting everything together with the source link in a separate document helped with organization. Allowed me to find specific information that I could find more easily. And by the end of the process, I was able to widen my horizon and knowledge on golden proportions. So I just end with a sort of short summary that just generally ends. You have to end it in a more positive note. That shows, okay, generally, I was able to do all this because of the research skills that I applied. And down here, I talked about the cards evaluation. So generally, whenever you talk about something like that, it's always good to include a sample of it. There's no need to include it for each source that you have that previously mentioned. Just choose one of them and show an evaluation of that source if you mention that you use such an evaluation. Because this also acts as evidence. And evidence is very important for Criterion B. And if you're choosing to evaluate any source, there's no need to use just cards. There's many other options. There's OPVL, there's the CRAP method. You can choose anything you're comfortable with that you know you're able to use effectively. This doesn't have to be cards. As long as you do some evaluation, should be fine. And the source that you choose, it's best to choose the primary source. Usually primary sources have more significance and it's also easier to conduct an evaluation on them. So it's best that you choose any primary source that you have. So credibility, what makes them qualified? I chose my interview. So I have my mathematics teacher who has years of experience teaching, and they're able to break down concept, teach the class, blah, blah, blah. So providing sufficient knowledge and experience to insightfully answer my questions. This just shows why they're qualified and just how they earn that qualification. I connected it to his job, which as a teacher requires him to skillfully break down a concept and teach it to a class. which requires him himself to have a good understanding of the topic. And just extra things is that you can easily ask for clarification or receive more details or explanations since he's someone I can easily contact. Reliable, dedicated to his job, they're willing to spend the time to explain some things I don't understand. And just an explanation of why this was credible. Questions are mainly debatable. The answers cannot be easily found without expert consultation. So my teacher's answers be able to provide me with another perspective and better insight. Moving on to accuracy, this mainly talks about factual, conceptual, but you can still link it in a way where you can talk about debatable questions as well, which is what I did. So I sort of explained most of my questions are debatable, and hence they do not have a specific answer. So I just explain in a way where it just so I don't have to focus on accuracy, but I focus on the quality of the answer and its depth, and whether it's something that should actually be discussed about or not. And I just mentioned there's also just a few factual questions I obtained in order to cross-check with the information I already had. And it allows me to better analyze my answers, matches the needs for my research. Moving on to reliability. Reliability mostly talks about any bias or subjectivity. So one strong point of this research, there's no need to worry about subjectivity and bias, as the main purpose is to obtain a professional perspective and opinion. And so I already state that there's no need for it to be so objective because the whole purpose is to obtain an expert opinion. But just to make my source even more credible, I say that my interviewee, even with being asked debatable questions, they did not just make one-sided biased opinions, but they actually provided solid thoughts and they actually provided a more objective answer supported by proper reasoning. So I can just say from this way of answering, it's clear that my interviewee was not trying to force opinion and merely suggested a new way of looking at the topic in hand, showing that the interviewee is more credible as any opinion they're providing with strong evidence. So even with debatable questions, we can say that the information provided is more reliable. And relevance is, for this situation, it will be relevance connected to the research question. How relevant is this source compared to what I want to answer in my research question? Okay, it's useful to me because I gain an insightful perspective on the significance of golden proportions. And we can see that I asked questions such as, is it possible that we are living in a golden universe where the golden ratio is connecting everything? What significance do you think will the golden ratio have in the future? So these are examples of questions that I include in my interview. And these questions allow me to consider how universal and significant golden proportions have been, what kind of influence they can have in the future. If you look at these points, they're all connected to my research question, in which they focus more on the larger implications, how it can impact the future. And for this, opinions and discussions are required. So hence, I conducted an interview. It makes it all connected, in which it shows this is one of the best sources to use to answer my research questions. And as for the date, of course, you can talk about when the interview was conducted, 22nd of July 2021. But besides this, if you're talking about usually any sort of expert source, you can generally talk about the period for data collection, in which it will be well past years. Because like any expert answers to debatable questions, especially in which you can't easily find an answer online, it is not something that comes in a day or two, but comes from learning back in university, teaching throughout his career, studying for lessons, learning the topic. So it shows a more long-term gain of knowledge, which we can all connect to and say that the period of data collection is really long, but the interview itself was just one day. And yeah, this is true for most expert sources. And finally, sources, they're you don't really have to include anything if there's no sources mentioned or cited, unless it's explicitly mentioned by the interviewee. And moving on to the limitations of the ATL skill research, there are obviously when you think of research skills, you don't think of any limitations, but you can just talk about what issues there are generally with research generally because they're talking about the skill itself, not your research plan. So you're talking about the skill. So what I wrote is that there's still limitations to what research skill has, so you can connect it a bit to your project as well. For me, relevant information on golden proportions cannot be easily found because it's not a topic that is often discussed. So one of the issues is relevancy in the information. Sometimes it's difficult to find the information. It may even be non-existent because of how loosely the topic is often discussed about. So the information is hard to find. Or it could also be outdated and do not apply to present times. That's also one issue that normally occurs with research. And some research conducted by professionals contains significant information or costly in the purchase. One other thing that could be added, and at the same time, when going to several sources, even using evaluation methods, it's still difficult to determine the credibility of the sources. Another thing to worry about is credibility because you don't, especially for my product, it's a book. I can't have any inaccurate information being spread out. Another thing is research results could easily become obsolete from new research and studies as information changes over time. This is also another issue. And as the project duration is not too long, it's difficult to be able to easily change information. And since if my product is a book, I can't change the information that easily after it's been published. And another thing you can talk about is how researching affects your critical thinking ability. Because after receiving opinions, you end up relying on that opinion you obtain. So you sort of maybe lose the ability to analyze and interpret information. If we're talking about research skills, these are generally some limitations that you could be including. And at the end, you should just include sort of short summary that shows that although there are these negatives, there are these limitations, overall, this is still a very useful skill to have. So you should always end on a positive note with nevertheless, nevertheless, my open mindedness increased, still have access to perspectives, opinion, so it's still positive in the end. Okay, that's all for the first skill. The next skill will be applying skills to create a project, in which I chose self-management skills. So as previously mentioned, you should always talk about what, why, and how. So we'll start talking about why we need self-management skills because I had approximately 5 months to complete the project. And even with that, I have schoolwork and extracurricular activities that I have to focus on. So time management is very significant. So this shows the necessity of the skill as in why it's needed. And next we talk about how the skill was applied. What I did is I created a mental time management rulebook. So it consisted of 4 techniques that I was following. First was to plan around my energy level because sometimes I could never find the motivation to be able to work. So I had to plan out on when my energy levels were high because that's when my productivity levels were high as well. So I mapped my energy levels for a week and made a spreadsheet on my energy levels for each hour based on a calculated average. And then taking this routine into consideration, I marked time slots where I would work, allowing me to determine the possible time slots to work every day. And I matched the tasks that I had to complete with the periods in which I decided I would work. So after I said I did all this, I should be showing evidence for everything. All of this can be considered to be my evidence, in which the first spreadsheet just shows all my energy levels at different timings, which is synonymous with productivity. And the second one just shows all the tasks I arranged in different timings. It's just a sample of my task distribution for a week. A sample is enough. So it kind of just shows my organization, how clear everything is with the hour, the energy, which day, what timing, what exactly will I do. And make sure you include whatever image you include, it should be big and clear. Size is never something you should compromise on. If it's not clear, it's pretty much the same as not being there. And as we did for research skills, we should be including the strengths and limitations of self-management skills. So the strengths, I no longer had an issue with motivation, which formed perseverance and determination. So it allowed me to still continue with my personal project while allowing me to be mindful of my other schoolwork. It shows that you're sort of an all-rounder. You're not costing anything else, but you're able to complete your personal project as well. So I talked about my first rule, working around my energy levels. Second rule, work on significant tasks first. It will form the most progression and impact on my work. So I would feel momentum and a sense of accomplishment, pushing me to work even further. The third rule was to set time constraints on myself, in which I forced deadlines on myself so that I before, because I previously had the mindset that I could easily change deadlines. So what I did was I forced myself to complete certain tasks so that it allowed me to actually complete my work in a shorter period of time. Then I would have last technique, remove all distractions around me. It hurt my focus and productivity. Yeah, and just a general conclusion. So this just generally breaks down everything I did and the benefit that each technique had on me. You don't necessarily have to focus on this type of self-management. That's an example of what you could possibly do if you choose self-management as your skill. As for the limitations, so one is that it requires promotion, transition in lifestyle, which can be mentally consuming because your style of working and not just for your personal project, your style of managing yourself for your schoolwork and everything else would be different. And it would be difficult to break out of your original management habits. And it caused me to fall behind schedule at times because of the change in schedule. And also, since this tactic had to be applied to my routine for other work, the confusion would be even greater. And besides this, there were times I felt low, not bringing myself to do anything. So there were a lot of emotional moments, but because of the properly managed schedule, it'd be difficult to sort of laze off because of the guilt you would feel. And so emotional management may have been too difficult to handle. So this is generally just an idea of what limitations you could include of having such a strict schedule. But as previously mentioned, whenever you talk about limitations, you should always end on a positive note because in the end, most of the limitations This skill brought me more strengths and benefits. So that's what I focus on. Here, just generally discuss the challenges. Yep, and that would be all for the Criterion B section of my report. Thank you for watching.